Hi, this is Adam Dunn, and welcome to the Voice of Dunn Books. I am speaking with Alan Schwartz, author of ADHD Nation. This is a new nonfiction title from Scribner. It is on sale now. Alan Schwartz is former investigative reporter for the New York Times. He is a Pulitzer finalist for his work on concussions in the NFL. He is a winner of numerous journalism awards, including the George Polk Award. Alan, welcome.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I want to just get right into the meat of this because there's just so much here. I want to make sure that within our limited time I don't miss anything. First of all, how big is the market for ADHD medication now?
Well, to the extent that the question would be, hopefully, that only people with an appropriate diagnosis would take the medication. Right now, 11% of children in the United States have already been diagnosed with ADHD, ages 4 to 17. So to the extent that about 2/3 will try medication, we're talking 7% of kids nationally. And given that there are about 56 million of them, off the top of my head, we're talking about 3.5 to 4 million kids. And then, well, some studies which have problems say that about 4.4% of adults have ADHD, which would be about 10 million. So, if everyone got diagnosed, then that would be another, 10 million people who would be candidates for medication. So it's a huge market pharmaceutically.
How about financially?
Well, financially, the same thing. I mean, that's one of the reasons why pharma comes up with new ADHD medications. The difference between the new and the old is extraordinarily small. There have been some good advances over the years. Concerta was a very big deal because it made ADHD medication once a day rather than 3 times a day. That was a really legitimate advance. Vyvanse is not as easily snorted as Adderall, as short-acting Adderall. But in general, ADHD medications just go through very, very, very small tweaks in order to keep the profitability, the patent alive or extended.
All amphetamine-based?
No, there are really 2 classes of ADHD medications. One is amphetamine, which would be historically Adderall and Vyvanse. And then there's another class called methylphenidate, which was historically Ritalin, then Concerta, Focalin now as well. Amphetamine and methylphenidate work virtually identically. There's almost no difference between the two in terms of effects and whatnot. So they're really interchangeable in many ways.
Now, the list of characters one encounters in your books is very extensive and ranges from school children to psychologists, psychiatrists, certainly pharmaceutical marketing experts and amateur boxers. Where are the neurobiologists?
I'm not sure what you're referring to specifically.
I'm just wondering if there has ever been a comprehensive neuroanatomical study of those with ADHD and how the medication actually physically and chemically functions in their brains.
Well, I got to say, that's not necessarily my area of expertise. Okay. What I did is I took a look at the evidence before us in terms of how many kids are diagnosed and how many kids should be diagnosed, how many kids are medicated versus how many kids are not medicated. And it's clearly completely out of whack. Right now, there are millions of kids being diagnosed with ADHD when they do not have it. A lot of kids are diagnosed appropriately, at least according to the APA. But what I did is I didn't question necessarily the neurobiological basis of medication versus not medication. My premise was that the medication can and has done good in many situations. And we need to, if we're going to accept, which I think we have to, that it's here to stay, that we need to be far more judicious in where we apply these diagnoses and these medications. I don't argue whether the medications should or should not be used, or even how they affect the brain. What we know is that they affect behavior. We know that.
Understood. But you do outline quite extensively and really very, very clearly here how big pharma and pharmaceutical manufacturers have used this to basically do a marketing blitzkrieg to push ADHD on to doctors and thenceforth really to parents. And yet they don't seem to have taken any kind on what medical or neuroanatomical basis do they rest the efficacies of the drugs that they have foisted onto the American public?
Well, the thing is, again, what I did is I looked at how these medications, and I accepted how these medications affect behavior. I didn't look at the neurobiological, neurons and synapses and the dopamine here and there. It's not a book necessarily about medicine as much as it is about society and how society chooses to apply what they're told is medicine to, well, their children and certainly adults increasingly now. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm just you do that brilliantly here.
Well, thank you.
The pharmaceutical manufacturers, however, when you describe some of the marketing practices and some of the truly appalling advertising campaigns that they have perpetrated, I'm not saying I understand you're not analyzing the medicinal makeup of how to treat ADHD, but these are the companies that are tasked with doing so, and I did not. How much evidence did they use when they were flying past these? For instance, you make this you cite this wonderful little 5-minute video on how somebody gets how to diagnose someone in basically 3 minutes or less. I think it was. It was some shockingly brief video.
It might as well be, yeah.
Right, and yet there's absolutely no medical basis for this at all. You also cite the fine print.
But let me just stop there, and I'm enjoying this. Okay, I mean it's good, it's important. When you say there's no medical basis for it, hey, look, I'm not going to debate with you one way or the other whether there is or there isn't, okay? Because that isn't the fight that I chose to fight. I understand it, and I think that that debate needs to take place. However, the way I handled it was more sort of as a mathematician, in the sense that we're going to have some axioms from which all of this is going to derive, and there are 3 of them. One, we are going to accept that ADHD as a cluster of behaviors exists, okay? Now, we can argue whether it's chemicals in the brain, whether it's a structural thing, whether the brain is smaller, which is something that came out in Lancet a couple of months ago. I mean, everyone's trying to say what it is. I don't need to say what it is. We know that the behaviors that people are concerned about exist. So, we're going to accept that our conceiving of a cluster of behaviors that we may or may not find troublesome exists. Second of all, the medications in general work on those, they mollify those behaviors because we just know that they do. And we know that some people value that. So we have to accept that, yes, these medications mollify the behavior. And third, the choice of whether to use those medications belongs with either the patient himself or herself or the parent on behalf of the child. And that within the bounds of the law, they should and will be charged with choosing whether they want to pursue that option. Those are the 3 pillars on which the entire book rests. I'm not going to argue whether it exists. I'm not going to argue whether the drugs or the devil's work. I'm not going to do it. I don't need to, because it's so messed up, even despite my granting those things, that I don't even need to fight that fight. I'm going after some pretty low-hanging fruit here. 15% of American children get diagnosed with ADHD when the American Psychiatric Association itself, in the official definition and handbook of what ADHD is and how to diagnose it, okay, the book and definition on which all of this rests says, and I quote, that population studies suggest that ADHD takes place in about 5% of children. Well, why are we diagnosing 15? And all I ask is that someone tell me what is going on.
All right. You also describe a kind of medication creep in the treatment of one of the subjects of your book, a young girl, about how when treatment does not seem to bring about the desired results, using ADHD medication, that doctors will prescribe other drugs, not despite ADHD or not something different, but in addition to, thus layering on and turning sometimes a very young child into a chemical puppet, sometimes before the age of 10. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, what you described really is fair. I mean, the puppet stuff I understand, but I think what we often think of it as is a medication cascade where there will be concern that a child has ADHD. Okay, fine. And if the doctor makes what hopefully is a thoughtful diagnosis, then perhaps Adderall or methylphenidate will be prescribed. The problem is that while it often can work the way that people want it to, sometimes it brings about sometimes the child then exhibits some other behaviors. Could be anxiety, could be defiance, could be, well, hopefully not psychosis. That's a little much. I mean, it happens, but not a lot. And what you'll see then is that some physicians will say, well, there's a lot of comorbidity between ADHD and bipolar disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. So why don't we try this other medication in concert? In concert with the ADHD medication, when, hey, look, maybe sometimes fine, but they don't seem to question whether some of the subsequent behaviors were a result of the ADHD medication. And so layering on top of that doesn't necessarily make any sense. It's not that the child has clinical anxiety or, oppositional defiant disorder or bipolar disorder. I mean, the last thing you don't pile on Risperdal if the kid starts acting, for lack of a better word, crazy. Maybe, it's the ADHD medication is backfiring, and way too often do they jump to the second or third and sometimes more medication, particularly in foster care. It's appalling how many medications many foster children are forced to take in order to mollify their behavior. It's astonishing.
Did your research for this book indicate any long-running, comprehensive, comparative studies of one ADHD medication against another over the course of time?
I got to tell you, there aren't long-term studies necessarily on specific brands, if that's what you mean, or methylphenidate versus amphetamine. Okay, the longest study that's ever been done and the most comprehensive one that has ever been done and continues to go on in some ways, although the results are not as compelling, I think, as people would think, is called the MTA study, the Multimodal Treatment of ADHD study, which came out, took about 4 or 5 years and came out in 97 or 98. Forgive me, I don't remember which one. In fact, it was 99, as a matter of fact. And it took a look at hundreds of children across the country at whether, to what extent medicinal treatment, in this case methylphenidate, not Concerta, but short-acting Ritalin, performed better than cognitive behavioral therapy or nothing at all, or both in combination. And unfortunately, the results of that study were really botched and really miscommunicated to the American public. And I write about that in the book. However, fine, they have done follow-ups. I'm going to get the years wrong, but after 8 years, after 12 years, taking a look at, what was the scholastic achievement of this now former child in the long run? Did they encounter any higher rates of substance abuse? That's a big one. These are the sort of variables that have been at the primary focus of research over these 25 to 35 years, where ADHD has been a huge source of concern among the psychiatric establishment. The specific medications long term, now that I think about it, you wouldn't even do that, because by the time there was any long term evidence that one drug was better than the other, it would be off patent and not valuable anymore to say, hey, Adderall is the best long-term treatment when it's gone generic. They're not going to bother doing that.
That's a good point that you bring up. I'd forgotten it. What is
Yeah.
the size of the generic ADHD medication market as opposed to the brand name one?
Well, that's determined by insurance companies, and unfortunately, a lot of insurance companies, I've heard an awful lot of cases, and just some the other day with somebody where, for example, any physician or any medical provider who prescribes short-acting Adderall, okay, to anybody over the age of 14 that's drug abuse, okay, because it is so abusable and so easy to either get addicted or just misuse in general. That's why they invented long-acting, frankly, or one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons you have Vyvanse. And so some of the brand name long-acting formulations are more expensive than insurance companies would prefer to pay for. And so in some cases, they force the medical provider to prescribe short-acting amphetamine, which is insane. It's completely irresponsible. And I get the role that insurance companies play, in medicine, and I'm not extolling their virtues or passing on the responsibility they hold. But in this case, it's crazy to require a medical provider to prescribe short-acting ADHD medication. To me, that is drug abuse. We focus so much on, drug abuse, the person who ingests it or administers it to themselves, who puts it into their own body. I actually have a wider definition of drug abuse. When a doctor doesn't pay any attention to what he or she is doing and prescribes class 2 controlled substances to people who are abusing it and who are quite clearly abusing it, that's drug abuse, in my opinion. And when an insurance company, in the face of all evidence, forces short-acting amphetamine on adult and teenage patients, that's drug abuse. It's crazy.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, when it was first published, I think, I don't remember the actual page count, but it seemed to contain a relatively small number of disorders and was only, well, it was a very narrow volume in its first edition. The last edition I saw, I believe, was the 6th edition, and it was at least a foot thick. Now, it seems as though with time, disorders as they come to light, they simply get tacked on one after another, but there's also a kind of splintering effect. And I wanted to ask you if that has occurred with ADHD, since it was, you describe its sort of a classification carousel that it went on. It was called this and then called this, and then finally we wound up with ADHD. Has there been any subsequent splintering from that monolithic disorder known as ADHD into subsequent disorders now filling up extra pages in the DSM?
That's a good question. Let me think about it. First of all, ADHD has splintered itself into inattentive type or combined type, and they've been sort of braiding those together in different ways over the years. I don't think ADHD itself has splintered, okay? What is happening a little bit now in the background, and I hope this is answering your question, is that some of ADHD's architects are proposing that a significant portion of ADHD diagnoses, actually the child should have been diagnosed with something that they have decided is called sluggish cognitive tempo, where a child just, their mind it's more of the daydreamy, inattentive children rather than the hyperactive, impulsive ones. And I think it's always been clumsy that the hyperactivity has been mixed with the daydreamy, kind of just doesn't really pay attention type. And frankly, girls, it's always been difficult to figure out the non-hyperactive girls, where do they belong? And so the idea of saying, look, let's take 2/3 of the ADHD kids and keep them in ADHD, but the ones who really don't have the hyperactivity and maybe impulsivity, let's say there's something else so that maybe there are more targeted treatments for that smaller group. So trying to refine you know, what ADHD is and how to target kids better, I think is a perfectly worthwhile pursuit. The problem is that these folks say it's not just the kids who are already diagnosed with ADHD who fall into this. There's another million kids out there with sluggish cognitive tempo who we have to go out and diagnose. They're not already under the ADHD umbrella, which would mean that that's, you know, we're when at a time when it is so clear that ADHD is misdiagnosed in millions of children. I say misdiagnosed, not overdiagnosed. I make a very strong distinction with those two things. Now we're going to put on top of that another million kids who wouldn't have otherwise been diagnosed with what is essentially a lifelong brain disorder, and one with the charming term sluggish cognitive tempo. And so I just think that these folks who have clearly shown so much enthusiasm for developing new diagnoses and developing new pharmaceutical treatments, and a lot of them are under the employ, literally or figuratively, by the pharmaceutical industry, here they are trying to create another diagnosis. And I do think that, and I don't want to sound naive, okay, a lot of people care about children. Okay. The problem is that the psychiatric establishment has gotten so frankly drunk on developing diagnoses, getting people diagnosed, getting people the treatment that they decide works, that I think they've completely lost track in how many people are getting misdiagnosed with that effort. And they refuse to consider all evidence that they have gone too far. They scoff at my book. They say, oh, you know, Schwartz, what could he know? He's not a neuroscientist. And it's just like, yeah, but I know that 15 is 3 times higher than 5, fellas. And you still haven't explained to me why this is happening. And they just want to ignore it. They just want to say, well, you know, ADHD is underdiagnosed, not overdiagnosed. So, you know, be quiet. And it's very frustrating because there's no question that a child with like serious ADHD who is not helped, that's a really big deal. And we can't leave those kids behind. We should try to help them in whatever way the parents and the doctor hopefully, thoughtfully, and conscionably want to try to help. These kids need help. However, the other kids who are getting, you know, pushed under or called ADHD when they really don't fit the definition, these kids have problems too. Okay. The problem is that their ADHD behaviors can be caused or brought on by other things, not just ADHD. Okay. Hyperactivity, inattentiveness, impulsivity can be brought on by many different things: anxiety, trauma, abuse, bullying at school, bad sleep patterns, you know, sleep disorders, dietary issues. And I'm not putting any of those things down or putting ADHD down. It's just an incontrovertible fact that those things can bring about ADHD type behaviors too. And the last thing, if your child, you know, has anxiety, the last thing you want to do is put them on amphetamine. Or if they're being abused or there's trauma, the last thing you want to do is diagnose them with a lifelong brain disorder. Okay. And we're just throwing out the ADHD diagnosis, sometimes correctly, according to the DSM, and I'm not going to go there. All I ask is that we do it as the DSM suggests, and we're not even coming close.